Good morning, everyone. On behalf of MedWet, I'm really happy to welcome you all to the fourth webinar of this series. First of all, some indication for the participants. Please note that this webinar is being recorded for later upload to our website. And to follow the webinar in your preferred language, you can click on the interpretation icon and then select the language, English or French. And also, please remember to turn off the microphone during the webinar and during the speech of the speakers. My name is Flavio Monti, and I'm the manager of the Certificate Technical Network on MedWet. And today with me, there is also our colleague and focal point of the Mediterranean Ramsar Site Managers Network, Mrs. Sana Mizuki, and our MedWet Communication Officer, Mr. Abder Smari. And this activity is part of the strategy 2 of the MAVA overarching project, and more specifically, it belongs to the MAVA project about disseminating knowledge and sharing experience for promoting wetland conservation around the Mediterranean. This activity in particular foresees the delivery of 5 different webinars, mostly held by members of the MedWet Scientific and Technical Network, which is a network of top scientists and experts on wetland-related issues from the Mediterranean region, working through 5 different specialist groups in key subject areas. This webinar series is principally dedicated to wetland managers, but also NGOs representatives, and open to all key actors in wetland conservation that play an important role on the ground to conserve wetlands. So to all of you. To support all of you in the mission, MedWet also established the network of Mediterranean Ramsar Site Managers, as probably most of you already know, which brings together wetland conservation practitioners associated to Ramsar sites in order to promote change in policy and action on the ground, with people dedicated to fostering to best management practices, knowledge exchange, and public education about wetland values and services. Before starting with the speakers today, we can briefly recall the calendar of the 5 webinars. So I would ask to my colleague Sana to kindly share the screen with the calendar. 3 out of the 5 webinars have been already done in the past months. So today is the 4th one about ecosystem services. And in this case, you have also the dates, and you can see the last opportunities for attending the other webinars, which is scheduled in May about climate change. For those who did not have the chance to participate to the previous webinars, do not worry, because you can find the recording on our website of Coastal Wetland Managers. So Sana, I would ask you again to share the link of this website.
Yes,
in the chat.
Okay, Flavio, I will share it on the chat box, okay?
Yes, perfect. Thank you very much. So that everybody can find the previous webinars and watch them in case you are interested. The webinar scheduled today is about evaluation of ecosystem services and socio-economic importance of the Mediterranean wetlands. So please, Sana, if you can share the agenda of the day, just to illustrate the timing and names and titles of the
yes, sure, Flavio.
Webinar.
Just a second.
Yes. Not hurry.
Okay, this is the agenda.
Okay. Thank you. So as you can see, today we will speak about ecosystem services. Ecosystem services or network contribution to people, as you know, is a topic of global importance. In this regard, wetlands do provide a high diversity of goods and services, ranging from coastal protection, flood protection, water supply, among others, So the management of wetlands in this sense should take into account conserving and sustaining these goods and services in the short, medium, and long term. At the same time, wetlands can also have important economic and social implications. So in particular, today we will focus on when and why it's useful to know the economic value of the ecosystem services, and we will try to understand better which are the most used methodologies to evaluate ecosystem services in wetlands. I am really pleased to have with us today two of the greatest experts in this sector that I'm going to briefly introduce. The first speaker of the day is Dr. Özge Balkits, who is the chair of the Ecosystem Services Specialist Group, the Scientific and Technical Network. But also she will speak about the ecosystem services of coastal wetlands. Özge did her master's degree on conservation genetics of mammals and her PhD on ecology and population dynamics of birds. She published both national and international scientific papers on this topic. And since the onset of her career, starting in 2003, she has been involved in local, regional, but also international scale nature conservation projects led by non-governmental organizations and different governmental agencies and private sector. She has especially been active in projects on site-specific conservation, but also ecosystem goods and services, management planning of different types of ecosystems, and on monitoring schemes, developing ecological service and developing also conservation approach and tools. So, good morning, Özge. It's a pleasure to have you on board. And the second speaker of the day is Vanya Statsu, Dr. Vanya Statsu, an environmental economist and at the same time vice president of the MedWet Foundation, and of course also members of the Scientific and Technical Network expert in the Ecosystem Services Specialist Group. And today, Vanya we will speak about socio-economic values of wetlands. Vanya in particular has also political and social science background and statistics background. She has worked for universities and research centers on consumers' preference for green technologies and practices, monetary evaluation of ecosystem services, and social capital. Vanya is a founder and vice-president of MedWet Foundation, as I mentioned before, where she is in charge specifically of natural capital and ecosystem services assessment and activities addressed to improve the sustainability in the private sector. For example, agriculture, agri-food, fishing, aquaculture, tourism, and many others. She's also technical coordinator of the Maristanis project that aims at creating a new integrated shared governance model for the 6 Ramsar site of the western coast of Sardinia Island in Italy. She's also an environmental advisor and supports companies and public administration in the adoption of sustainability indicators. So I think that we can now start with the first speaker of the day, Dr. Özge Balkits, presenting ecosystem services of coastal wetlands. So Özge, please, the floor is yours. I would like just to record that if you would like to ask questions, you can click on the raise the hand button at the bottom of the screen, or write the question directly in the chat, and we will have time after the talks of Özge to answer to all questions. So Özge, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'm happy to be here. Thank you very much for the invitation. I will try to share my screen. Is it full screen for you as well?
Yes. Yes, it is.
Yes, it's working.
Not now in full size, but okay. Because we can see also
case,
the.
Yeah.
Yes.
I have.
Now it's fine.
Oh no, sorry. I think I need to do it again, right? Now you're seeing it like normal presentation, not in full screen.
Yes, exactly.
Okay, just 2 seconds again. I'm using a monitor which makes some surprising jokes like this. Sorry. Can you see it in full screen now?
No. Not really. Okay, we can see also the next slide on the left.
Is it still the case? Because I can see it full screen. If not,
not yet.
okay. Okay, what I can do is I can try something else. Just I can. Is it better now? Can you see it larger?
Yes, it's better.
Yeah, okay. Thank you very much again for the invitation. So this is Özge Balkız. I'm based in Turkey, and as Flavio said, I have been working on ecosystem services for wetlands, for forest ecosystems, and mainly looking at ways to integrate the know-how, the knowledge on ecosystem services into planning, into conservation, given the pressures, given climate change and so on. So my perspective was always looking at this team, ecosystem services, as a tool for conservation and sustainable natural resource use. So I will try to present the ecosystem services concept in general, and also some specific examples about wetlands and coastal wetlands. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the term, but just a brief baseline to make sure we are all on the same page. Ecosystem services, in fact, corresponds to everything, all of the benefits that we obtain from natural or even semi-natural ecosystems. The concept, of course, we human species, as a species, we always were aware of the benefits we get from nature, like in terms of food, in terms of water resources, but this term, the terminology, became, let's say, widely known thanks to an article that was published by 1997 by Costanza and his team. And for the first time, through this article, in fact, it was made visible that this benefits that we get from natural ecosystems does have a real corresponding economic value. So in the slide, you can see two values. One of the two is the value of the different biomes, the natural landscape, let's say, of the world economically. And the second is the GDP of the world. So it was, let's say, surprising for the scientific community to see that, in fact, the benefits that we get from the natural ecosystems is up to 3 times bigger than the GDP of the world per year. So the first figure, which is on average $33 billion that belong to the estimate that year, is what the natural ecosystems provides to humankind every year without any return and due to their natural functioning and processes. So this is where the topic, let's say, gained importance, also given the economic input of the natural ecosystems. The second milestone on the topic is the 2005 publication of Millennium Ecosystem Assessments. It's one of the first publications where a classification and more clear definitions of the term was given. So ecosystem services, there are different types of classifications today, given that the topic has gained more importance. There are more studies, more diverse approaches, like European Union uses the CSES classification, IPBS uses another. So there are different organizations, but let's say the oldest and more classical classification identifies 4 different types of ecosystem services: provisioning, regulating, cultural, and supporting. Provisioning ecosystem services is, in fact, what we receive from nature directly. So these are crops, they are fish products, they are mushrooms, wild foods, or they are biomass of different types of ecosystem services, or of course, fresh water when we think about wetlands. So these are we can say, the most studied, the most well-known type of ecosystems, given that they are easy to observe, easy to value, easy to understand. Regulating services is a second type, and it is the outcomes of natural ecosystem functioning. So this, like climate regulation, is a topic which is of high importance nowadays due to the climate change. And we know well now that forests, peatlands, and oceans do contribute to local, regional, or global climate regulation, and it is of essential importance. This is not something that we contribute to. This is how forests function, by capturing carbon from the atmosphere, and this is how they function naturally. Or water purification of the wetland plant species, aquatic plant species. By nature, they're able to absorb the water, minerals, and other chemicals and purify the water, let's say, for our use. Or pollination, again, a kind of regulating service that we talk a lot, given that the contribution of animal species, bees, butterflies, or other insects, or even mammals and birds, do contribute to pollination of crops, and even they have a huge importance for the global crop production, so food safety, let's say. So there was provisioning services, which is directly the goods that we receive from nature. There is the regulating services, which are the outcomes of natural processes. And there is the cultural services, the third type. In fact, this is mostly, I'm sure all of us agree with that, especially given that you're all wetland managers, that we are more happy in nature than in a commercial center or in a street full of buildings. So this is by nature, our body reacts to nature is being happy. So there's religious values, there's educational, inspirational values, or the landscape itself gives us inspiration for our art, our music, and there is aesthetic value. So this is a topic which is studied more and more in the last, let's say, decade. And also wetlands' relation to cultural services. I will give an example to this, how wetlands are appreciated by people visiting them. And the last one is supporting services. This is mostly, in fact, the profound, the longest term services, which in fact permits life to exist on Earth. They are the least studied because their period, the time period that permits them to evolve is much longer than our lifetime, let's say. So they are the most complex. We know them well. They are water cycle, carbon cycle, nutrient cycle, or primary production. These are the supporting services, but most of the studies are focused on the provisioning, the regulatory, and the cultural services of natural ecosystems. One important thing that was highlighted in the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment and their own is to show that these are not services that we benefit from, but they are also important for human well-being in terms of security, in terms of health, in terms of good social relations, even freedom of choice, and basic material of good life. So this is to emphasize how, in fact, the topic is important for us human societies globally. And a figure from a publication of 2016, it was shown that, you might remember, I just gave an example of pollination. It was shown that 5 to 8% of the current global crop pollination, which is contributing to, like, on average, $400 billion worldwide, is directly attributed to animal pollination. There was some studies that assessed whether it is possible to replace this fully through technological advancements, through mechanical interventions. And the last time I checked, it was seen impossible. So we really rely on this service for our crop production, and it is critically important. So given the critical importance, the recognized importance of this topic, of course, there are more and more, this topic is recognized in the scientific and political agenda. And there is one organization that I would recommend, if you haven't heard from it before, that I recommend you all to look at the publications. It is the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, or shortly IPBS. And this is the image you see is in fact the report which shows which gave that pollinator example. So its idea is to establish the link between science and policymakers to show in fact how biodiversity and ecosystem services are critical and how they should be taken into account during the decision-making process. So it's made up of voluntary scientists and experts who produce this information, and then IPBS establishes the link and brings it to the forefront for the policymakers. And as of course, the number of studies increased, the approaches on assessing ecosystem services topic also changed. On the right side, you see let's say the older point of view, which is more, the studies were more looking at the economic value of ecosystem services. But here on, there are diversification in the valuation, there are spatial mapping, there is the integration of ecosystem services into planning, there is the economic valuation and participatory assessment. So the more we know about the topic, of course, the more different approaches was identified and more people are working on. And of course, ecosystem services became a topic also integrated in international agreements, strategies, and legal processes. One example on this is, of course, the most important convention on biodiversity at the global scale. It is CBD, and its old Aichi targets, which was covering 2011 to 2020 period, which is now finalized. They recognized in two of the targets the importance of ecosystem services and biodiversity, how they should be conserved through effective and equitable management, and how they contribute to, and how they should be restored and safeguarded. In the post-2020 global biodiversity framework as well, maintaining ecosystem services is highlighted, and the 2050 vision is living in harmony with nature. So it relies heavily on sustaining these ecosystem services and continuing our benefit from them. There is also, when we look at European Union countries, there is also the Green Deal, which is in fact, if everything works as in theory, to transform EU into a modern, resource-efficient collaboration of countries, where there will be no net greenhouse emissions, where there will be the economic growth will be decoupled from resource use. So resource use will be more sustainable. And there is one action, set of action specifically on environment and oceans, where the ecosystem essential services or ecosystem services is highlighted. Of course, we all know that we are far behind, unfortunately, halting the biodiversity loss. So all these actions should be ambitiously carried out if we want to sustain these ecosystem services. Another important progress was the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, which were developed in 2015, and with 17 targets, and two of them, especially life on land and life below water, were recognizing how ecosystem services should be conserved. In other words, the countries globally acknowledge that for a development to be sustainable, we should conserve the natural ecosystems and the services that we get from them. So this is the path to the sustainable world. Yet, of course, I'm sure you all know this better than us. When you look on the ground, especially on wetlands, things are not evolving better, but rather deteriorating. You might remember the first study of Costanza in 1997. They published another in 2016, I think, and they showed, in fact, what they calculated as 33 billion per year at that time in the first article should have been, in fact, 145. Even better techniques to estimate the number, given better data. Yet, this number decreased to $125 billion per year. So the numbers are not important really. The important thing here is that they showed that the benefits we received from ecosystems have decreased from that study with like $20 billion per year worth. And the main decrease was in marine and terrestrial ecosystems, with wetlands, unfortunately, a big part of it, like tidal marshes, mangroves, swamps, floodplains, and coral reefs were the main contributors to this decrease. And what are these benefits that we are receiving from wetlands, but which are being deteriorated? Again, going back to Millennium Ecosystem Assessments, they, under those classical four groups of ecosystem services, there is the provisioning services, let's say. There's, of course, the fisheries support, there's freshwater, there's peat production from peatlands, or from regulating services, there is flood mitigation, there is storm mitigation, especially in coastlands, carbon sequestration and water purification, or the cultural services benefiting from the landscape. So these are just things that we all know what we benefit from wetlands, but which are, let's say, classified under a more formal definition. A recent publication of the Ramsar Convention, the Global Wetland Outlook, also shows the different kind of ecosystem services that we receive from wetlands. Again, like fish and other food production, genetic resources, water supply under provisioning, or water purification, flood mitigation, and waste decomposition under regulating. And you can see there are many of them. And this is because wetlands are very productive systems and we receive many benefits from them. And one of the statements of the Global Wetland Outlook, and you can find this also in the coming slides I will show, on contrary to what is demonstrated, like especially how forests are important for carbon sequestration and other ecosystem services. In fact, the benefits that we receive from wetland ecosystems are far beyond what we receive from terrestrial ones. These include freshwater, fiber, fuel, food, or other examples I also give. Of course, the contribution of peatlands here is very important. They occupy only 3% of the land surface, terrestrial surface, but they contribute to more than twice the carbon sequestration of the forests. And also salt marshes sequester millions of tons of carbon every year. You might remember the SDGs. There was the two targets that were linked directly to ecosystem services, but in fact, this is a graphic showing how all of the wetlands and how they contribute to, in fact, to all of the targets, like good health and well-being. The third target of SDGs is linked to how tourists, half of international tourists seek relaxation in wetland areas, or how climate action, the 13th one, is linked to peatlands, or how healthy wetlands mitigate the risk of poor access to water, especially for 5 billion people, which is the 10th target of SDG, the reduced inequality. So in fact, you can find the links with all of the SDG targets with wetlands. So that's how they are important and then they matter. And also another important publication on this, which is the second of the two publications, the Mediterranean Wetlands Outlook. And it is aimed at monitoring the state of wetlands and the different ecosystem services they provide at the Mediterranean scale to come up with solutions for sustainable wetlands. And in those reports, it was shown that inland and coastal natural wetlands do contribute to an ecosystem service of more than $50 trillion per year, link it to, again, a study of Costanza, and they are mostly water-related benefits, yet their deterioration, so the loss of wetlands, causes every year up to $20 trillion. And these are critical figures that I also mentioned before. We receive so many services from the wetlands, but given the state of wetlands, the loss also annually is increasing. So what are those benefits? This is again from the Global Wetland Outlook, and in red highlighted part, you can see the coastal and marine wetlands. So far we talked about the wetlands in general, but when we look at the coastal and coastal wetlands more in detail, the colors here correspond to how high, in fact, they provide those services. So if you look at the yellow things, like yellow boxes, you can see like salt marshes contribute highly to climate change, or they also contribute, mangroves contribute highly to hydrological services, and also spiritual and inspirational services are supplied, or aesthetic services are supplied by medium strength from those ecosystems. These are just to demonstrate how, in fact, all of the wetlands, but coastal wetlands more in detail, do contribute to different ecosystem services. And there are many studies carried out on wetlands. This is a review. It is not, of course, corresponding to representing the full picture, but just an example. And this is showing, in fact, the different kind of provisioning, regulating, supporting, and cultural studies that were carried out by which method on wetlands. So there is the biophysical methods, qualitative or economic valuation studies. And if you look at the end part of the row here, you can see most of the studies relied on the biophysical methods. And when we look at the different ecosystem types, sub-ecosystem types, let's say, so the coastal wetlands in the red box you see, again, majority of them looked at the biophysical methods, and some still looked at the economic valuation. And this one, again, lots of figures, but just want to show you one part of it. It is not a very recent study, it's from 2012. But here I just wanted to demonstrate, in fact, in red, you see the coastal wetlands, freshwater lakes, inland wetlands as well. And their total economic value you can see, and you can just compare it with the forests, which are always pronounced more, but in fact the values are much more higher for wetlands in terms of ecosystem services. So if we take the economic value as an indicator of importance, they can be seen as much more important. And this is the same table, just summarizing the values in red for wetlands, which is far superior, higher than those in forests. And a recent study on storm protection, again by the well-known Costanza and his colleagues, on 2021, aimed at looking at how coastal wetlands was important at the global scale for storm protection. So in the first map, you can see the economic damages avoided per year. So the more the color turns to orange, the higher the contribution is. And below is the annual number of lives saved by the wetlands. So they didn't only look at the economic damage, but also even lives saved by the wetlands. And again, the more orange the number is, the higher the prevention, the conservation of lives saved by the wetlands. So they looked at more than 1,000 tropical cyclones since 1902 in 71 countries, and they assessed that the coastal wetlands do provide storm protection of more than $400 billion, and every year more than 4,000 people's lives were saved thanks to the presence of those coastal wetlands. So there are 40 million such coastal wetlands, especially in areas where the storm risks are high, and thanks to them every year per hectare $11,000 worth saving was done. So this is again, and not only looking at the economic value, but really saving lives, how coastal wetlands are important. Yet I always, unfortunately, give the good side, but also talk about how things are getting bad for wetlands. So the 2019 publication of IPBES showed that, in fact, all of the terrestrial and marine ecosystems are unfortunately deteriorating. But so this is 75% of land surface was estimated as altered. 66% of ocean area is experiencing increasing impact, but the number for wetlands is much more alarming. 85%, more than 85% of natural wetland area, so this doesn't include artificial wetlands, they have been lost. And this is also shown in the Living Planet Index of WWF, showing the changes between 1970 to 2016 in the surface of natural wetlands, with a global number of up to 84% unfortunately decrease. And this is showing how, in fact, these changes, this graph shows how these changes in wetlands also influence the different services provided. So the direction of the arrow gives an indication of whether it's increasing, whether it's decreasing, and the color shows its importance. So if it's let's say green, it's highly important, and if the arrow is decreasing, it is of high magnitude that there is a change. For example, for water regulation in rivers, let's say there is a high decrease, or for genetic resources in wetlands, which is important for delivering the genetic resources, there is a high decrease. Or under the supporting services for the provision of natural habitat free of weeds and pests, there is a significant decrease in wetlands. This is an example from New Zealand. This is not a global example, but still I think it's applicable to many regions also, including Mediterranean. The same is true for peatlands that are very important for carbon sequestration. So it is estimated that up to 15% of peatlands are drained for agriculture, and up to 5 to 10% is degraded through vegetation. So these, in fact, show us that it is important to monitor the changes to wetlands, and also monitor how these changes affect the goods and services that we get from ecosystems. And Ramsar, similarly, one of the targets of the strategic plan of Ramsar is to have all of the countries, all of the member states, to have assessments at the national scale on the ecosystem services. And so far, the 2018 data set showed that it's quite few of the countries, only 24% of countries had carried out such an assessment. So it's very important to have national assessments. And below, an example from the İşgöl National Park in Tunisia is given. Given the importance of the topic, the Mediterranean Wetlands Outlook 2, which monitors, in fact, wetlands through a set of 13 indicators, they dedicated 2 of those indicators to the state of ecosystem services, one on flood regulation and one on education and tourism. So in those reports, the experts had a look whether the flood regulation in 5 basins, 5 countries in the Mediterranean have increased or decreased between 1987 to 2016. On the below map, you can see the dark blue is the 86 number, so the older one, and the purple is the more recent estimate. This one is the supply. So the supply, the provision of that service by the wetlands have decreased, yet the demand is increasing. And they estimate there is a decrease by 20% in the flood regulation capacity of the wetlands in the last 30 years. And this graphic shows, in fact, some of the natural wetlands, natural floodplains have decreased in the coverage of landscape, while the urban areas are increasing. So
Par contre, les zones urbaines ont augmenté. Donc, ça veut dire que la surface diminue, qu'il y a eu
flood regulation. Yet the news is good for education and tourism. They have shown that, in fact, there was an increase, especially in the sites where the wetland managers had given a higher dedication to this. So there was a higher possibility or probability that the sites were visited by visitors and enjoyed them. So below you see the map, which shows, in fact, the more the site managers dedicate efforts to the wetlands, the higher the visiting probability, let's say, was. So this ecosystem service is not deteriorating, different from flood regulation. Yet, when we think about the long term, there is the climate change that we need to think about, of course. In all of the IPCC reports, this topic is highly emphasized for wetlands. So Mediterranean Wetlands Outlook, in fact, showed that in comparison to past, up to today, there was in some sites, in some wetlands, there was significant, moderate or significant increase in temperature, yet in some site precipitation increased or decreased. And this was related partially to the protection status. So this graphic shows, in fact, the sites that are protected, some part protected, or more than 50% protected. So if you look at the orange and yellowish dots, which represents no protected or partially protected wetlands, let's say, their temperature is higher and their precipitation is less. So this is to demonstrate how protection efforts do matter, especially when we take into account climate change. So I also recommend all of us to have a look at especially the summary for policymakers. They are shorter, they are very synthetic. Of the 2 IPCC reports, I will just give some parts of those reports, which recognized that the degradation of the wetlands, it is mentioned that it can, with medium confidence, it can reduce the carbon budget, and also overall, also taking into account the existing pressures on wetlands, the climate change will add upon those, and also that will have a high impact on wetlands with very high confidence. And also a very dramatic number, global coastal wetlands will lose between 20 or up to 90% of their area, depending on emission scenarios. So the more we emit, the higher its impact on coastal wetlands. One of the last examples I have is related to climate change and sea level rise. And also when the sea level rises, how the coastal erosion impacts the coastal wetlands and the services they provide. So they carried out the study at the scale you can see on the map. The map shows the reddish the color, the higher the coastal ecosystem services lost because of the sea level rise. And the below graphic shows up to 2100 under different climate change scenarios, some more severe, some more soft, how the total ecosystem services worth billion euros will change. And as you can see, unfortunately, regardless of the scenario, some are decreasing much more, but still the overall trend is a decrease. So it's estimated under this study that coastal erosion will increase in all scenarios, and the decline in services will also be relevant in all scenarios with up to 42 billion euros per year. Again, from IPCC, it is mentioned that restoration is important. Ecosystem-based adaptation to climate change is important, and how coastal wetlands should be conserved given their service, protection for coastal erosion and flooding. So if we have deteriorating coastal wetlands, we will have much more problems with coastal erosion and flooding. So for the future, I would like to finish by saying all these studies show us that we should enhance our studies towards assessing and also monitoring the ecosystem services of coastal wetlands and all of the wetlands in general. And also not looking at the state, but identifying those that are vulnerable. For example, in face of climate change, so that we can identify which of the wetlands and which services we should really concentrate our conservation efforts, our restoration efforts, our ecosystem-based adaptation or nature-based solution efforts. So we should always use this approach, this tool, to identify where we should focus our conservation efforts for the future long-term provision of those services. Yes, this is all I would like to say. I hope I didn't pass my time.
No, it's fine. Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay. Thank you for this very interesting and detailed talk, which gave us an overview of the subject and with a particular focus on wetlands with clear examples and so on. So we have some time for questions. I think, Oskar, there are some comments on the chat. If you would like to have a look, I have noted this. One, for example, Nashed asked, how do we evaluate a given ecosystems, in this case, wetland services in dollar, money, and there are other comments before.
Yeah, for, I think, economic valuation, I can leave that to Vanya. So I think that will answer her topic, but if there are other questions, I can check. Also, one thing I forgot to mention, there is also the new, let's say, terminology from IPBES. So to avoid that this topic is only seen as an economic tool, they have, and also to integrate more the social human dimension into it, and the terminology of nature's contribution to people was identified, NCP. So there is an evolution in the terminologies adopted in ecosystem services work. That was one point. I see that. Did I miss any questions, Flavio, maybe?
Not for the moment, but I would like to invite all the participants to raise the hand button to make questions or write directly in the chat. And see if there are no immediate questions while waiting from other participants, I would like just to have a comment or reflection to propose, okay? Because in the slide referring to the relative importance of ecosystem services derived from different types of wetlands ecosystems, natural against human-made, it seems to me evident how natural wetlands provide medium to high services compared to the human-made ones. But at the same time, for many ecosystem services, this importance is actually unknown or never been under investigation. There are many NA. So at the same time, we know that artificial wetlands are spreading in contrast to natural ones. So I would like to know how increase our knowledge or pay greater attention to quantify those ecosystem services that are still little known in order to further protect natural wetlands, and if there is any virtuous examples in this regard to cite. Is there any country working in these issues in particular?
Thank you very much. I think it's very good. Also, I think if I'm not wrong, given the increase, in fact, in the human-made wetlands, the overall decrease of wetlands globally, I think it decreases from 85 to 35%. So there's a huge increase of dams and other water reservoirs and pools and other types of human-made wetlands. For me, this was the only study where I came across this distinction of human-made versus natural ecosystems. So I'm not aware of many examples on those, but I am aware that it is recognized that the trend is quite opposite to one another for natural and semi-natural or completely human-made ecosystems. So, and I think we should rely, as you proposed, enhancing and sustaining the ecosystem services that we receive from natural wetlands, in terms of also, because ecosystem services is a quite human-oriented approach. So, and it is, many studies cannot really assess how they are important for biodiversity, for habitat provision. There are efforts, but we know that the natural ecosystems do contribute to biodiversity conservation, richness, much more than the human-made artificial side. So it's critical to fulfill those not known services, to make studies to correspond to them. I agree.
Okay, thank you, Otke. And I don't know if Vanya would like to add some words about the first question in general, or would just wait for her talk after that.
Yes, maybe I prefer to reply later. Yes,
later. Okay.
After we see the presentation, the input to my speech, some things that was already anticipated by Ogse. I will give some more clues on the economic valuation, so on the techniques, just to say something to the guy that asked something more, and how we have to use the economic valuation to obtain information that are useful to manage properly wetlands and ecosystem services, to have economic and also social benefits. So I will give you more details later.
Okay, great. Sounds good. Okay, so is there any questions from the participants in particular to the Otke talk? Yes, there is one in the chat. Okay. Is it studied the effect of combined degradation of coastal wetlands on their ecosystem services? For example, the pollution of water can impact the wetlands wildlife, affecting then fishery and hunting activities. Thank you, Nicolas, for this question.
Thank you. In fact, those figures where a collective number was given for the loss of ecosystem services for wetlands, they took into account different ecosystem services like pollution prevention, like fisheries and others, given the site, of course. So yes, many studies do follow that approach by looking at combined effect on a driver and how it affects different ecosystem services, and at sometimes how this corresponds to an economic value. So in some of the examples I give, it was also the case. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And would also like to ask very generally, what are the main difficulties in communicating ecosystem services to governments of interested countries in general, and how do they respond actually?
In fact, I think the approach has evolved this much thanks to its strong communication power, because it's much more powerful than just conservation, in, of course, not for me, but for the political, let's say, environment, because it really relies on a benefit aspect. So it is something beneficial for us. So it is not doing something just because it's ethical, it is animal rights, that's much harder to communicate. But still, I would say it depends on the country, like with countries like Turkey, where the development urge is quite high and economic power is in the hands of the private sector or other industrial sectors, even that communication aspect is not working very effectively. But I would say, from my feeling, this, let's say, tool, ecosystem services tool, has evolved so much because it is a positive by itself service. For example, we don't talk a lot about the disservices, so the negative impacts of ecosystems to people, and I think it's also a little bit of political or strategical decision. So the idea is always to demonstrate how we will be excluded from the benefits that we are receiving if we don't do something right now. And it is adopted also in IPCC, also in IPBS. But yes, it is, I would say, more powerful. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Otke. We have still 5 minutes, so if you have other question, you can write in the chat. Meanwhile, I would ask to Sana to share again the agenda of the day, because actually we would have a very short coffee break. Yes, there is another question on the chat, but Sana, you can continue to share the screen. So Otke, yeah, I let you answer.
How to integrate the values of ecosystem services in the management plans and management of wetlands, especially, in fact, the examples, in my experience, what we do is we always rely on spatial mapping of wetlands. So we do both economic valuation, but also looking at the land use types or the habitat coverage of a site. It can be a wetland. You can identify the different type of ecosystem services provided by those areas in a given map. So you can spatially integrate that information on a map. You can even identify sites which are more preserved, so which provide more, better, let's say, or more ecosystem services, or which are more vulnerable. So for example, you can take into account water provision service of a wetland. You prepare the map, and then you can look at the future climate expectations, climate change expectations, and the drought risk in your area. You can put it on top of your water provision map, and you can identify the sites from where you're receiving that water provision service currently, but which will be risked in the future because of drought due to climate change. And those two information can show you where you should start to work on for conserving the wetland which parts of the wetlands especially, and also to continue to sustain that service of water provision. So spatial studies do provide that integration to planning, but of course you should have a baseline for that. I know that the Mediterranean Wetlands Outlook reports, they relied also on the different land use and land cover types. So this is one of the most common approaches, again, on spatial work. So you identify which land use, land cover types provide which type of wetlands, which type of ecosystem services. And then from there on, you can build upon and prepare your plan, whichever. What I gave as an example was a conservation plan, a management plan, or for a forest, you can again identify the sites where you benefit the most from carbon sequestration, or a peatland, you can do the same. And then if you have a production plan, again on a spatial map, you can put those on top of one another. And then you can use both information looking at whether if you would like to have that service like carbon sequestration in the long term, whether you should continue to forage that part of the ecosystem or not. That's how, in the projects I'm involved, that's how we worked. And I hope I responded to your question. I think there is another one. In order to value an ecosystem, is it preferable to verify its richness and sustainability indices according to American? I am not value in terms. I think it's not in terms of economically. It is that evaluation maybe. If it's economic, I can again leave it to Vanya. But if it's looking at it, I think you can do. It depends on your goal. If your idea is to show how the different ecosystems and their states corresponds to the different services, for example, the wetlands provide, you can map the state of the different habitats in an ecosystem. Or you can aim at assessing the link between the SDGs and an ecosystem and saying, well, especially these ecosystem services corresponds more to those SDGs. You can also carry that out. It depends on your goal, and it's possible, I would say. But if it's economic valuation, I can leave that part to Vanya. But mostly the studies start with inventories of the different land use types, of different habitat types, and the state of the habitat types, ecosystems, and their functioning level. So you can also, you will need to have a resolution higher than just one habitat type if you want to carry out, let's say, better ecosystem services mapping studies. You will need to detail what type of habitat, whether it's in a good state, whether it's still healthy, functioning. You can look at all of those details to come up with an evaluation. And I think the other question is about the economic valuation, so I will leave it. And land use change via satellite monitoring. Yes, the last question is about whether we can monitor the land use change via satellites, or maybe it's a comment, I don't know, but I can just respond to it assuming it's a question. So the graphics that I gave examples from the Mediterranean Wetlands Outlook, in fact, you might remember one was with flood mitigation, and there what they do is exactly as in the comment. They looked at the change in the land use and land cover types with time to see whether there was a deterioration, there was a change in the wetlands at the Mediterranean scale, and how this impacted the flood protection service they provide. So this is exactly how to look at it if you would like to look at how things changed so far. And you can also look at the future and project how things will change in the future. That's what we do with climate change projections. Like you can look at the changes in, for example, Korean land cover type to say this is the level of deterioration. On top of that, we expect that there will be a further deterioration this much in terms of drought, in terms of increase in temperature, in terms of decrease in precipitation, and you can integrate that into your maps. But yes, that's how it's exactly done. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Özge, and thanks to everyone for all the questions. Interesting question, actually. And yes, it's now time for a short coffee break. So we can come back at 11:20. So I left up there, Osana, to share a nice picture, and yes, we can see in 10 minutes for the talk of Vanya. Okay. See you in 10 minutes. Have a nice coffee break.
Thank you, Flavio.
Thank you, Flavio.
Thank you, Flavio.
Okay, welcome back. I hope you take your coffee, and I don't know if you are all there. You can just check quickly. In any case, I think that we can start again. Well, if in the first talk with Oscar we stressed the importance of the ecosystem services provided by wetlands, it seems that in some cases they appear to be still neglected or not fully perceived by countries or civil society. So it's also important to integrate other approach and methodologies to highlight their importance. So as Vanya will now present us with several practical and economical examples. So now is the turn of Vanya, presenting socio-economic values of wetlands. Vanya, so please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Good morning to everybody, and thank you for inviting me to speak about the economic valuation of ecosystem services. I think that you can see my presentation. No?
Still not.
Not yet.
Not yet? Okay, let me try again.
Yeah, now we can see.
Okay, you can see the full screen?
Yes.
Yes, okay,
yes.
Perfect. So the first question is the question that generally people ask to me: why economists are interested in environment? Why environment is so important for economics? Just some figure from the EU Biodiversity Strategy for 2030. Over half of global GDP depends on nature and the services it provides. So nature is fundamental for economics, and preserving nature is basic for having a good economics. Another important figure refers to coastal wetlands, because in the COM 308, EU points that protecting coastal wetlands could save the insurance industry around 15 billion annually through reducing flood damages losses. We know that wetlands are the best nature-based solutions to mitigate the impact of climate change, like coastal erosion and sea level rise. And invest in wetlands, invest in nature, could avoid costs that we are still paid to preserve or to compensate the current damages. So it's really important today for all the people who is involved in territorial management to have an idea of the value that will be lost if we lose environment. Generally speaking, so very shortly, neoclassical economic theory consider nature as one of the inputs of the production function with the job and capital. And generally speaking, we think that neoclassical theories imply a trade-off between environmental preservation and economic development or profits. So we generally suppose that the people that invest money in some economic activity is not interested also in preserving the environment, but simply to use environment to maximize their profits. This is a simply slide to understand how also economic theory changed along the time. So effectively, the basic neoclassical production function focus on land that includes all the primary raw materials, job, the number of human workforce, capital, monetary investment, and savings that could support monetary investment. But in the along the time, the analysis on the real situation showed that this picture was too simple to understand what happens in the real context. So several concepts was changed. For example, today we don't speak about simply workforce, the number of people working in a sector or in a company. We speak about human capital, the level of competencies of the workforce. We don't speak only about the flow of money, but also about social capital. So the level of interpersonal trust, institutional trust in a society that could facilitate the exchange between people in a society and also the economic exchanges. Concerning also nature, we don't speak simply on land or in the primary resource, but today we spoke on natural capital. So if before we consider only numbers and the quantitative elements that could influence production and economy, today we focus more on the qualitative attributes that qualify all these elements like capital, job, and land. Today we focus on the natural capital. What is natural capital? The OECD stated that natural capital are all the natural assets in their role of providing natural resource inputs and environmental services for economic production. So natural capital is basically the stock of all those services and inputs that ecosystem services, habitats in a good status could provide to humans for their needs. In the definition, OECD clarifies that natural capital generally includes three principal categories: natural resources, stocks, land, and ecosystems. And preserve all these three elements is essential for the long-term sustainability of the development, because without preserving these three categories, we have a lack of the provision of the function that ecosystem give to the economy, and also could severely affect mankind survival. Just to make an example, we are speaking about wetlands. In wetlands, there are some fish. The role of wetlands as a reservoir of biodiversity is an ecosystem function. When these fish are harvested by humans to be using for their eating purposes, they become an ecosystem services. If a local economy is based on harvesting and selling fishing from a wetland, if the wetland disappear or the quality of the water in wetlands is too bad to let that this fish could be harvested and selling, so the local economy based on the fish will disappear. So it's essential for the economy to preserve ecosystems. The point is that why is it important also to know the value of the nature? Okay, we understand the importance of keeping ecosystem in a good status because they provide services, and these services have also an economic element. But why is it important to know the value of nature? This is something that I refer to this joint work of IUCN, Nature Conservancy, and the World Bank. So World Bank is one of the main stakeholders in the economic term in the world. And they summarize these values in the 4 statements. it's important to value the nature to determining the value of the total flow of benefit from an ecosystem. And this is most important to know this when you are thinking to make some intervention in an area that could improve or reduce the total flow of benefits. This is most important also at the national level. What we saw before in the OGSE presentation with the studies of Constanza and others at the worldwide level are mostly referring to this kind of reason. But the value, the total flow of benefit from an ecosystem could be made also at the local level, not only at the worldwide level. And this is most important when you have to invest some money in some public intervention in an area that could alter ecosystem conditions. You need to understand if the net benefit of improving or destroying an ecosystem, just to simplify the reasoning, are overcompensated by the net benefits. And basically, this is very easy. It's more easier to do this in economic terms. The other point, very relevant, is to examining how the costs and benefits of an ecosystem are distributed. When you put an intervention that changes condition in a territory, even if they improve environmental condition of an area, or even if they decrease environmental conditions in an area, it's really important to understand who will win and who will lose after the intervention. Sometimes there are difficulties in convince people to accept intervention at the territorial level because they perceive that they will lose something, or that this intervention will be made to make an advantage to some other stakeholders. So to correctly analyze the part of the population who will be benefited or disadvantaged by this intervention, is important to avoid that the loss of the citizens' support to this intervention. And also it's important to identify potential financing sources for conservation. For example, if the improving in quality of a wetland will improve also the revenues of the touristic sector, the local manager could ask touristic sector to support activities to keep the ecosystem in a good level. This is also because in some contexts, the public sources of financing the management of wetlands and or the private could be not enough to let managers to correctly manage the ecosystem services, the ecosystem, and to keep the ecosystem services. How to compare the advantages? Just to clarify a little bit what I was telling before. Generally speaking, when we ask about intervention in territory, we have two extreme visions: preserving the ecosystem, in that case a wood, or destroy part of the ecosystem to have the road that could help local communities to achieve several purposes. Okay, this was the basic element of the debate on the introduction of the ecosystem valuation in the public support systems. Then this very strong opposition was reduced, and people started to understand how to keep the land, so the wood, but also to achieve all the benefits that the roads could give to a community, comparing several different alternatives. Today, generally we speak about finding the optimal mix of wood and road, because keeping the wood and having the road are both able to provide benefits to local communities, and we are not obliged to choose the wood or the road, but fine to have a mix. All these things of questions refers to a technique, that's a methodology that is usually used to understand the benefits of a public intervention, that is cost-benefit analysis. Cost-benefit analysis is an ex-ante methodology. So before to do an intervention, you have to understand which of the several alternatives that you have, including the alternative zero, so doing nothing, leave the situation in the same way that it is, so the status quo, could benefit the area. When you, in some cases, cost-benefit analysis in the past excluded the ecosystem services analysis because there was not awareness on the importance of ecosystem services. But if you exclude ecosystem services from the cost-benefit analysis, you will underestimate the benefits that keeping the wood will give you compared to the benefits to having a road. Because unfortunately, all the benefits that we will achieve building a road are really clear, and also the cost is more difficult to understand all the benefits that could be achieved from the wood and their value. So it's important today, when you refer to cost-benefit analysis, to be sure that this analysis is made taking into account ecosystem services. As you know, because we saw in the previous speech, the ecosystem services can be referred to different categories, so provisioning, regulating, cultural, and supporting. These ecosystem services refer to different units of measure. For example, the food provided by a lagoon can be measured in the tons of fish harvested. Concerning cultural ecosystem services, the tourism importance of a wetland can be quantified by the number of visitors. Concerning regulating, the climate regulation ecosystem services could be measured with the tons of equivalent CO2 emissions. The level of water purifying service could be measured with the value of nitrates in water. So ecosystem services can be measured using different units of measure. And sometimes, for example, in a cost-benefit analysis, you need to have a unique value to be inserted in the analysis that represents all the importance of all the ecosystem services. Monetary evaluation can solve this issue because all ecosystem services are translated in a unique unit of measure, which is the money. The ecosystem services refers to these different categories, and of course can be evaluated using different methodologies. The main difference refers to the possibility to refer to market values or not. In the economic evaluation techniques, there are two main categories of techniques. Revealed preference techniques, okay, consider environment as an attribute of a tradable good, and we can estimate the value, the monetary value of the environment based on the market price of a tradable good. I will explain later this concept. Static preferences are mainly used for non-market goods, not only environmental goods, but these techniques was created mainly to give a value to environmental goods, or what today we call ecosystem services. You can use the static preferences also for new products. In the customer analysis, you use static preferences, for example, of goods in a team market, when buyers and sellers are low, so exchanges are low. For example, stated preferences were used in the renewable energy markets to understand the willingness to pay of citizens for PV panels, just an example. With state preferences techniques, consumers are directly asked to state their willingness to pay for an improvement on the level or number of ecosystem services, or willingness to accept a compensation for a reduction in the level or number of ecosystem services. Just some backgrounds. The economic theories is split into large categories: microeconomic and macroeconomic. Microeconomic theory refers to individual, consumer, citizens, what do you want, and refers to the way that each individual allocates his budget according to the market price of goods and their preferences. In the macroeconomic theory, the objective of each individual, consumer or citizen, is to maximize their utility function. So the reason why two consumers with the same budget in the same market allocate their budget in different ways is preferences. Okay, so basically all valuation techniques, markets or non-market related, refer to consumer, citizens or individual preferences toward environmental goods and environmental protection. These preferences are related to the utility that each consumer receives from the ecosystem services and the values attributed to the relevant ecosystem services. So, monetary valuation of ecosystem services is mainly a way to understand consumer citizen preferences for public investment in ecosystem preservation or restoration. When we speak about economic valuation, generally we focus on the final figures, but the importance of these techniques is also to understand if citizens or consumers are interested and are aware on the importance of keep an ecosystem in a good status. And this is important because the social acceptance of public project is fundamental for their success. If local communities are not aware of the importance and also on the benefits of improving environmental quality, they will not support the local administration action. Just an example is, I don't know, in Italy it's very, very common that when a public administration decided to create a new natural park, part of the local stakeholders are against the new park because they are really aware on the constraints that a new park will introduce in their economic activities. But generally speaking, they are not aware on the advantages that working and living and producing in an area with higher environmental quality could have for them. So be aware that basically, monetary valuation could give you useful information on what the consumers or the citizens want, what they think, the level of awareness, and also which category of citizens and consumers are against, which are in favor of investment in environmental quality, in improving environmental quality is fundamental for the managers. What these techniques try to estimate? They try to estimate the total economic value. The total economic value is split in two large categories: use values, non-use values. Use values are the direct use value that refer to consumptive or non-consumptive activities. For example, consumpting activities are those related to the provisioning ecosystem services, and non-consumptives, for example, are related to cultural ecosystem services like recreational, for example, or mental illness, that is one of the ecosystem services provided by also the wetlands. The other is the indirect use value, and I will explain later what is indicated. That there are option values, quasi-option values. Concerning the non-use values, we have the existing values and the biggest values. I put an error because this is the standard classification of all these values, but in some cases, in some studies, you can find that the biggest values is a sort of option values, so a use value. But the difference between option values and the you refer to the possibility that you and people that are now in your community could in the future receive some benefit from an ecosystem, while the biggest values refer to the next generation. It is really related to the concept also of sustainable development. Okay. So when in the past we consider the biggest value as a non-use values, today we consider an option value. The quasi-option value today for some authors have to not be considered in the total economic value because it refers to the possibility to obtain more information that let user to postpone a decision about the alteration of an ecosystem because you don't have enough information of the consequences of this alteration. So generally today, the quasi-option value is excluded from the total economic value. So the basic non-use values are the existing values. So I want that the wetlands in Sardinia are kept simply because I think that wetlands could be important, even if I don't eat fish from wetlands, even if I don't love bird watching, even if I don't have children to left the wetlands heritage. So simply because I want that the wetlands keep in my land. Altruistic values is a sort of existing values, but is referring to the others. I want that the wetlands stay in Sardinia, even if I don't benefit from direct or indirect use values, also from option values, because I want that the people that benefit from wetlands could still be benefited by these ecosystems. So I just make some introduction to the details. So direct use values are, for example, provisioning recreational uses. Indirect use values refer to those ecosystem services that require a collaboration between humans and nature, for example, pollination, that is really important for the a lot of agricultural activities, or flood protection, that is also a sort of in ecosystem services that provide benefits for people living in the coastal areas, but also there is an interaction within with the condition on the coastal that could be more or less modified by the humans. Option values is the personal or intra-general future use, so the possibility in the future to keep fishing from the ecosystems. While concerning non-use values, okay, existence values is mainly related to cultural ecosystem services, for example, the attachment values that a community could have for a wetland, despite even if they don't have direct values use. And the biggest values that is like the option values, but is an intergeneral, so the future use, but future use that refer to future generations. So the techniques, reveal preferences are a list of different techniques that refer to market values. So for example, we have the pronation function that could be used to all the goods that are produced and that are related to environment. Cost of illness and human capital is also a way to understand how the loss of good quality of environment and the related ecosystem services could affect the humans. And we have a price for the cost of illness, both morbidity and mortality. Replacement cost or avoided damage cost, relocation cost, which are all related to the market cost to restore, for example, an ecosystem that are severely damaged, or the costs that will be necessary to avoid that this ecosystem will be lost. Direct market price that are used, for example, for all the provisioning goods, for example, food, tissue, and so on, because you can refer to similar goods sold in a real market. Sometimes also the food, so the fish, for example, provided by wetlands are sold in a real market, so you directly have an estimation. The travel cost method that is basically used to evaluate the tourist and recreation ecosystem services, and the hedonic prices that extract environmental factors on price of goods that includes environment-like attributes. It could be applied to several different ecosystem services, mainly those that refer to landscape, so the cultural, like scenic beauty or other cultural benefits, or air quality, water quality, and so on. The different techniques depends on the use of different techniques depend on the different ecosystem services that you are analyzing. As told you before, provisioning ecosystem services refers to goods such as food, tissues, raw materials, handcraft, medicine, bioplastic, and so on, that already have a market. So you can refer to these markets to find the price of the ecosystem services provided. It's not so easy to understand what means market price, of course, because, for example, if I refer today to the market price of some goods like crops, I know that the price today is much higher than the price last year, because last year there was the pandemic that reduced the trade at the global level. Today, there is the effect of the war that are influencing the price. So we need also to pay attention when we consider the market price, because we need to be sure that these prices are not biased by some element. And sometimes it's better to refer to an average price for a given period of time than to the single price. The other market evaluation that we saw are related to, for example, flood protection. All these costs also refer to the investment in infrastructure that could be produced. Infrastructure means traditional infrastructure, but also green infrastructure. So all the infrastructure that you can use to avoid these costs. The production function approach can be used, for example, in this situation when both man-made and ecosystem inputs collaborate to create products. For example, the production of honey or pollination on fruits is a typical example of the production function approach. This approach is mainly used to estimate indirect use values as those provided by regulating and provision ecosystem services. Travel cost method refers to the tourism and recreational activities and basically estimate the value of the ecosystem and the ecosystem services as an attribute, so of the total cost that an individual or a family support to travel from their house to this ecosystem. And you need to include all the costs: travel, accommodation, food, entry ticket if applicable, etc. In some cases, especially in the past, some studies include also the opportunity cost. So the cost of you have a time, you use your time to go in a trip to visit an ecosystem, not to work. The wage that you lose because you are in trip is your opportunity cost. In the past, economists usually take into consideration opportunity cost. Today is difficult that we use because we more refer to the benefits that to have a trip in a natural ecosystem system could give to individuals than to the money lost. The hedonic value method is basically is focused on the fact that environment and good environment could be an attribute of a tradable good and could influence its price. The most easier example concern building sector. You have a building, that have a value. If this building is surrounded by polluted companies, polluted activities, or I don't know, ecosystem, for example, lakes or wetland with poor water quality or noise or low air quality, the price of this building could decrease. On the other side, if this building, the same buildings with all the other elements equal, so structural characteristics, but also services, is surrounded by nature, the price of this building could be higher than in the other situation. And the analysis of these elements could give you the value of the nature for this community. Also, in this case, it's not easy to make this evaluation, even if the method is simple. For example, one of the wetlands that surround the city of Cagliari is surrounded by several cities, an airport, and industrial area. So you need to pay attention when you make this analysis to consider all the elements, because we don't know if the price of the houses in the municipalities that surround these wetlands are more influenced by the wetland or in a positive way, or by the industrial area and the airport in the negative way. Okay. Set preferences approach are basically two: contingent valuation and choice modeling. The two methodologies could be applied to any kind of service and consist in asking respondents to indicate their willingness to pay or willingness to accept for an environmental improvement or reduction, and asking to act as they are in a market situation. When you write your questionnaire, you have to design an hypothetically but likely scenarios in which people must express their preferences. The basic difference between the two methodologies is that contingent valuation refers to environmental good as a unique attribute, and respondents need to accept or refuse the prices that you propose, while choice experiment described the environmental good as a set of attributes, and you have to make a trade-off in your choice between the different attributes. And respondents are asked to select a scenario. Just to give you a small example, this is an example of contingent valuation that we have applied in Sardinia, where we are evaluating ecosystem services and the monetary valuation using the TESA methodologies, thanks to the collaboration with BirdLife International. And we ask people, we present the current situation of the lagoon and in alternative state with an improvement in environmental quality. And we will ask people if, given the income and the budget for the trip, they were asked to pay an entrance ticket to visit the lagoon, if they would accept an entrance ticket, in this case of €2. If the respondents were willing to pay €2, they reply yes, and we will ask them if they will be willing to pay an higher entry ticket. If they are not willing to pay the €2 as an entry ticket, we will ask if they will be willing to pay a lesser ticket euro amount as entry ticket. And this is basically how the contingent valuation works. The choice experiment example is different because you have to select your preferred scenarios among different scenarios, and one scenarios have to be the status quo, so nothing changed. And your scenarios is made with different levels, different quality of environmental level, for example, of attributes that refers to environment if some intervention is made. In this case, for example, it was about improvement of water ecosystems. It refers to the creation of buffer areas around lakes, rivers, and wetlands that could have several different impacts on the ecosystem services. So, for example, they will improve recreational activities, but in some cases they could reduce agricultural activities. So there will be a trade-off between the attributes that describe these ecosystems, and basically the attributes reflect the several different ecosystem services that the ecosystem could provide. It's not easy to adopt these techniques. Basically, you require people with skills in economics, statistics, and econometrics competencies for data collection and analysis, especially for stated preference methodologies. And you need that people that apply these methodologies is very, very aware on how to build questionnaires for the elicitation of preferences, because otherwise you could underestimate some elements or to introduce some bias in the description that could give you wrong results. And this is also the way that social psychologists and sociologists quite always today support economists when they have to apply stated preferences. And this is also the way that the most important researchers in this topic, Professor Kahneman, who won the Nobel Prize in economics, is a psychologist, because to analyze preferences, to take into account all the elements like attitudes, beliefs, and so on, could influence the preferences and the perceived utility that citizens could obtain from an improvement or simply a change in the ecosystem services level. And you need also to be careful when you collect data from the market, as I told you before. And generally speaking, data collection for revealed or stated preferences is quite time expensive, and you need a dedicated budget for these activities. You need also to use specific softwares to analyze data. Today, fortunately, we have some open source softwares that you could use. If you need to do economic valuation and you are not able to use all the other methods, you could use the benefit transfer method. Benefit transfer is a procedure that lets you to take the estimate from economic benefit of values gathered from one site and apply them to another site. So you can put the values obtained by researchers from another site and use for estimated values in your site. But please, you be really careful, because revealed static preferences or market estimation are time and site specific. So you need to be careful in looking at those studies that are all simply made in the same area you are, but in another time. That is tricky, but could be easier to use, or in the current time in areas which are really similar to the area where you are. Otherwise, the risk is to introduce really value, or to use values that are not true for your context. There are some studies called meta-analysis studies that provide a range of values for each ecosystem or ecosystem services that try to eliminate all the external influence that could give results that cannot then be transferred to other studies. I put referring to this interesting Plummer studies, that is the use of benefit transfer for the evaluation of ecosystem services. He refers to also wetlands, and explain that, for example, if you want to estimate the value of the fishing activity in your wetlands, traditional benefit transfer generally use the estimation made in one area, in one wetlands, and transpond in other wetlands, basically using the number of fishermen of the number of days of fishing activities. But when you spoke about ecosystem services, okay, you are not simply referring to an economic activities, you are referring to the services that an ecosystem is providing to you. So when you map ecosystem services, you are always working at the territorial level. And so the best way to make this transfer of values is to estimate the value per hectare of acre, and then adjust the value in your context per the number of acres or hectares. So if fishing activities in another context is, I don't know, 20 100,000 euros per year, per hectare, I don't know, you need to transfer this value per hectare and not simply the number of the days of activities or the number of fishermen, because these values do not refer to ecosystem services and are difficult to be related to simply to ecosystem service. Otherwise, you can refer to some useful tools that are still available. For example, the TESA toolkit that I used in Maristani's project is an easy tool to identify wetland ecosystem services through a participatory approach. It focuses more at a local scale. This includes simplified methodologies for monetary evaluation of some specific ecosystem services, but it includes also a qualitative analysis that you could use to understand if the ecosystem services in your area are increasing or reducing. And TESA works with the comparison between the current level, the current values, and the values in an alternative state or scenarios that could include the improvement of reduction in environmental conditions. Another tool, ConsigNature, is a web-based spatial policy support systems that calculates a baseline for current ecosystem service provision and allows you to understand how these ecosystem services will change after that a series of intervention, which are policy options or scenarios, will change the situation. And another interesting tool is INVEST. It's a suite of models that used to map the value of the goods and services from nature, and is focused on the services that sustain and fulfill human life. So it's specifically addressed for ecosystem services. INVEST is a tool that uses maps, so you need also to know how to manage some geographical information system tools, and use the production function approach. So it's specific for some regulating or provisioning services. And it gives how the output of the ecosystem services provided by the environment changes if the condition and processes changes. Finally, the rapid assessment of wetland ecosystem services is a really simple tool to assess the positive or negative contribution that wetlands ecosystem services could give to a local community at a local, regional, global scale. It's really simplified and is based on asking people to indicate. And in that case, you need to pay attention of the number of people that you include in your analysis, because of course, also the perception of contribution of the ecosystem services at the local level and the community level could be different from the different categories of stakeholders. And sometimes the local perception is not equal to the real condition that we can measure with data, because also the preferences influence perceptions or vice versa. So you need to be sure to include all the relevant stakeholders in your analysis. Okay, I have the same figures of OGSE for the wetlands, coastal wetlands values, but I simply want to show you that if you look at the coastal wetland values, you can see that the range of values is quite large, and it's dependent because the different studies refers to different contexts, and these different contexts could include elements that give to the very, very different results. It's the ecosystem that show the range of values most larger than the others. Okay. I can stop here.
Okay. Thank you very much, Vania, for this interesting talk. We have now also better understood the economic value attributed to ecosystem services and different methods to evaluate these. I think you have a question on the chat that was made before.
How to integrate ecosystem with the high ecological value into economic circuit without disturbing its balance.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's not totally related to the economic valuation, this question. Of course, when you know your economic valuation of the ecosystem services, of the value of an ecosystem, you can also understand how the changes could affect this value, and to try to select a correct mix of intervention that give you a satisfactory level of ecological value. I don't know if for example, in a positive way, we can speak. If you decided to create a new natural park in an area, fishermen could be scared that some new rules reduce the amount of fish that they could stock, because we created the natural park to preserve the stocks of fish that could be endangered. Of course, that will improve the biodiversity ecosystem services provided by the wetlands, but we reduce the value of the provisioning ecosystem services for the fishermen. You need to find a balance, of course, and you need to understand the current amount of fish that could be collected by the fishermen without severely affect the fishermen income, but obtaining also environmental objectives, achieving environmental objectives. The other point is that if you have the economic value, for example, made in other contexts, you can show fishermen that if you reduce the number of fish that could be harvested, it will increase the stock of fishing. They, in a couple of years, they could harvest big fishes that could have a higher value in the market. Not only, they could sell the same category of fish at a higher price, because people know that the fish are harvested in a place with a high environmental value. And this is the big issue of the environmental, the economic valuation of environmental ecosystem services, is the communication. As Ogse correctly showed before, the milestone of these methodologies was the Costanza study that was published in 1997. So we have a lot of studies that comes back from the past century, but the point is that we never use, because we was economists like me was not able to communicate to make people aware of the importance of having these tools in their daily activity. And this is the big point. Sometimes we need to make people aware of the ecosystem services, on the importance to improve ecosystem services and the environmental value of ecosystem services, because they don't know, simply don't know. My experience in the Marine Studies projects is that even there are 11 municipalities that are very close to the 6 Ramsar sites included in this project. People are not aware of the all ecosystem services provided by the lagoons. And if you are not aware on all the benefit, you are not interested in keeping the wetlands, or if municipalities ask if they have to invest public money in preserving wetlands, of course, people, if is not aware of the benefit, will be will disagree with this decision. So I repeat, the real importance of these methodologies is not only to have a monetary value that is fundamental for cost-benefit analysis and other public support system, but is also fundamental to understand citizens' preferences for the public choices on the local environmental quality. And of course, I think that all the people in the world prefer to live in an area with a good environmental quality, but sometimes they simply don't know that the ecosystem that are surrounding their area are providing ecosystem benefits. So.
Yes, that's true. Thank you very much, Vanya. I particularly appreciated the presentation of existing tools to support this evaluation. I was wondering if some of the participants have already experienced about that, but in this regard, I noticed that there is a specific question on the chat.
Of course, I show simply some examples. There are also some other tools that are available. I show the ones that I use or that I have more ideas that are more useful for people. Of course, if you look, go to the sites of TESA, Invest, and so on, you can find the handbooks, instruction on how to use. My experience in TESA is that there are some, generally speaking, TESA could be useful also by people that have no specific knowledge in environmental economics, just basic statistics, but there are also some qualitative methodologies that everybody could apply that refers to simply asking people if some ecosystem services are increased or reduced along the period of time. In other cases, there are instruments like Excel files and so on that could be provided to you by people with, in the case of TESA, there are people from BirdLife International and other institutions that could support you if you are interested in applying. Concerning Invest, for example, you needed to use QGIS or other software for mapping. But QGIS is open source, so you can find also all instructions on how to use. It's not easy to mapping and to give a monetary value to ecosystem services, but this tool make you easier the job. With the standard economic methodologies, you need to refer to people with a PhD in environmental economics, basically, or people with a PhD in economics. So, yes. But the first things that I could say to you is to look in Google Scholar if there are some evaluation made for your site, because sometimes we are not aware of what is have been done in the field of monetary evaluation of ecosystem services in our area. So the first advice is to look in Google Scholar if there are someone that try to estimate some ecosystem services, because of course, if you want to have a complete analysis, you need to use different methodologies for the different ecosystem services. Basically, the variable studies focus in one or two ecosystem services and apply one or two methodologies, not all.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Vanya, for these answers. And I'll leave Sana to intervene.
Yes, thank you, Vanya. Thank you for your good presentation. I would like to invite you all to switch on the camera and to have a group photo, if possible, and say wetlands while smiling. Hiding in OK. Nice. Je voudrais vous inviter tous à ouvrir vos caméras pour une photo de groupe. Merci. Merci, c'est bon, Flavio. À toi.
Okay, great. Well, I would like to thank the speakers, first of all, Vanya Healthcare for the presentation of the day and all the participants, of course. Special thanks to the translators for their continuous support. And just to recall that for those interested, we can see you at the next and last webinar of the series about climate change and wetlands on the 19th of May. We will send you, of course, the save the date email and all the necessary information for participating and attending the last webinars. So I would like to say thank you once again. Merci à tous.
Merci. Merci à tout le
Bye.
monde.
Merci. Bye bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Merci beaucoup, merci à tout le monde.
Thank you.
À la prochaine.
Merci beaucoup.